Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something big. We want to analyze the underlying architecture, really, of the modern revolution of the self.
Yeah, it's quite the task. Our mission, if you will, is to figure out a puzzle. Why is it that statements, which would have sounded completely radical maybe 50, certainly 100 years ago,
Like, I am a woman trapped in a man's body.
exactly that? Why do statements like that now get, well, intuitive agreement from ordinary people?
And we're not talking about academics here or people deep into philosophy. We mean, your neighbor, maybe your coworker, people who likely haven't read Foucault, but they just nod along. It makes sense to them somehow.
That's the core of it. And what our sources suggest is that the sexual revolution, which is maybe the most visible part, is actually just one facet of something much deeper. A revolution in how we even understand what a person is.
The really unprecedented claim today seems to be that our sexuality, or maybe identity more broadly, is somehow central to authentic personhood.
Right. And to get a handle on this, we're leaning on some heavy hitters. The philosopher Charles Taylor, the sociologist Philip Rieff, more psychological sociologist, really, and we'll touch on the ethicist Alistair MacIntyre, too. They give us a framework.
Okay, so let's start with Taylor. How do these, high-level theories from intellectuals actually filter down? How do they end up influencing everyday thinking?
That's the perfect place to start. Taylor gives us this concept he calls the social imaginary, and it's crucial to get this. It's not a theory people consciously hold.
Okay.
It's more like the shared background understanding, the stuff carried in images, stories, everyday practices. It's the way things seem to be. It's what makes common sense. It lets society function without everyone needing a philosophy degree.
So it's the gut feeling of the culture almost.
Yeah.
The intuition.
That's a great way to put it. So why does Joe Smith kind of get the trapped in the wrong body idea? Not because he read Judith Butler. It's because his social imaginary, his, let's say, intuitive social taste, tells him that affirming someone's chosen identity feels right, feels kind.
Yeah.
And not affirming it feels, well, hurtful, maybe even oppressive.
But how does that taste get shaped? How do these ideas actually change the water we swim in, so to speak?
Well, Taylor points to how elite ideas can filter down, but often technology acts as a huge catalyst. It changes our practices first, and then the way we think about those practices catches up.
Can you give an example?
The classic one is the sexual revolution. Think about it. Historically, sex outside of marriage was incredibly risky, right?
Sure. Pregnancy, disease, social ruin.
Exactly. But then you get widespread, cheap, reliable contraception. You get antibiotics that treat STDs much more effectively. Suddenly, the practical risks plummet.
The behavior becomes safer, technologically speaking.
Right. And as the practice becomes less risky day to day, the old rationales, the arguments against that behavior, they start to seem less convincing, less plausible to the average person. The tech changed the reality on the ground, and that shifted the social imaginary over time.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's broaden out a bit. This seems connected to a really fundamental shift in worldview you mentioned, moving from seeing the world as something we conform to towards seeing it as something we create.
Yes, exactly. This is the big contrast between what we can call mimesis and poiesis. For most of history, the dominant view was mimetic.
Mimesis,
Mm.
like mimicking.
Sort of. It means the world has a given order, a given meaning. Our job as humans is to discover that meaning and then conform ourselves to it. Think about medieval farming life. You're completely dependent on the seasons, the weather, the land. You couldn't change those things.
You had to fit in with reality.
You had to. Poiesis, on the other hand, think poetry. Creation sees the world more like raw material, meaning purpose. These aren't things you discover out there. They're things you, the individual, create. You invent your purpose.
That's a huge shift. But hang on, how does technology play into that? You could argue technology makes us more dependent, in a way, on complex systems supply chains.
That's a fair point, but the key insight here isn't about absolute independence. It's about the feeling, the intuitive sense that the world's fixed authorities are weaker. Technology attenuates the authority of the given order.
How so?
Look at the examples. Irrigation, soil science, we started manipulating the land itself. Cars, airplanes. They didn't just make travel faster, they fundamentally shattered the authority of geographical distance. London feels closer to Philadelphia now than maybe Chicago did 200 years ago, in practical terms.
In medicine.
Right. Antibiotics, safer childbirth. These things dramatically weakened the sense that nature held ultimate authority over life and death. We gained a feeling of control.
So this constant experience of manipulating the external world, it primes us to think we can manipulate our inner world too.
Precisely. We start to intuitively imagine reality itself, including human nature as pliable, as something we can shape according to our will. Very few people have actually read Nietzsche, the philosopher who really championed this idea of self-creation.
Will of power.
Yeah. But lots of people now intuitively think in these sort of Nietzschean ways. The idea of creating yourself, inventing your own meaning becomes, well, normal. It becomes part of our modern social imaginary.
And that makes claims about fundamentally redefining one's own identity, like transgenderism, seem plausible, or at least understandable within that framework.
Exactly. If the external world is raw material and even our bodies seem subject to technological modification, why wouldn't our identity be too? It fits the background logic.
Okay, this feels like a natural bridge to Philip Reef. He talked a lot about this inward turn, didn't he? This triumph of the therapeutic.
He absolutely did. Reeves gives us another crucial piece of the puzzle. His core idea is that traditional cultures are defined primarily by what they forbid. They have taboos, clear moral lines, collective commitments.
And they direct the individual outwards.
Yes, towards communal goals, towards participation in shared life. In those cultures, the self isn't something you invent. It's something you learn by conforming to the community's expectations and demands.
He traced a kind of historical decline of that outward focus, right? Through different character types.
He did. He saw a progression away from external sources of identity. First, there was political man. Think of the ancient Greek citizen finding identity in the life of the polis. Then came religious man, finding identity in shared faith and practice, like Chaucer's Pilgrims.
Then the rise of capitalism brings.
Economic man, identity found in work, production, providing. Reef mentions the example of a grandfather whose job satisfaction was simple. Did it feed his family? It was empirical, outward-facing.
And the final stage.
That's us. Psychological man. This is the modern type, Reef argues, who finds identity not in politics, religion, or even work per se, but in the inward quest for personal psychological happiness, for well-being, for fulfillment.
Which sounds almost identical to Charles Taylor's idea of expressive individualism.
It's very parallel. Expressive individualism is exactly that, finding meaning by identifying your unique inner feelings and desires and then expressing them outwardly. Authenticity becomes the highest virtue. My life has meaning if it truly expresses me.
You see that everywhere. Think about career advice today. It's all about follow your passion, find work that fulfills you.
Exactly. It's not just, does the job pay well, or is it useful to society?
Sure.
The primary criterion becomes, how does this job make me feel inside? My internal psychological state is the judge.
So if everything becomes about inner feeling and psychological well-being, what did that do to our commitments, to institutions?
This leads to what Reef called two historic reversals, which are absolutely central to understanding our time. First, the very purpose of therapy flips.
How so?
Well, traditionally, therapy, like psychoanalysis in its early days, aimed to reconcile the individual to the demands of society, to the community's rules and symbol systems, to help them fit in, essentially.
Yeah.
But modern therapy often takes the opposite approach. Influenced by ideas that society itself is repressive, the goal becomes to protect the individual from society's potentially damaging conventions and expectations, to liberate the self from neuroses caused by social pressure.
So society shifts from being the context for healing to being the source of the sickness.
In this view, yes, and that fuels the second reversal, the direction of commitment. Historically, primary commitments were outward to God, to the nation, the community, the family, the union.
No.
Now, the primary overriding commitment is inward to the self, to one's own psychological health, happiness, and authentic expression. All other commitments become secondary, conditional on whether they serve that primary inward commitment.
And our institutions start to reflect that. They become less about forming people into something.
Right, less about shaping individuals to fit a communal mold and more like platforms, stages where individuals can perform their pre-existing authentic selves and expect affirmation.
Can you give an example of that?
Education is a prime one. Think about the intense focus now on making classrooms safe spaces. Now, safety is important, of course, but the emphasis shifts.
From intellectual challenge to emotional comfort.
Often, yes. Traditionally, education might involve confronting difficult ideas that challenge your beliefs, maybe even offend you. That was part of growth. But when psychological well-being is paramount, anything that feels disturbing or challenging to one's inner state can be framed as unsafe or harmful, and thus needs to be avoided or rejected. The institution must bend to protect the individual's feelings.
This leads directly to what Reef called the analytic attitude, doesn't it?
Right.
If my inner self is paramount, and denying my identity causes psychological harm.
Then my well-being demands that you affirm it. It's no longer enough to just tolerate me. You must actively recognize and validate my inner reality. Because if you don't, you are inflicting psychological injury.
The refusal to bake the cake, for example.
That becomes the textbook case. It's not seen merely as a disagreement about marriage or religion. Within this therapeutic framework, it's interpreted as an act causing direct psychological harm to the couple by refusing to recognize the legitimacy of their identity and relationship.
And that's the crucial leap. Harm becomes primarily psychological.
Which is why, as we've predicted, language becomes so intensely policed. If the main form of harm and oppression is psychological, then words aren't just words. They can be weapons. Hate speech isn't just offensive, it's viewed as inflicting real injury.
And that puts freedom of speech under pressure because the need for psychological safety for validation starts to outweigh it.
Exactly. The therapeutic demand for affirmation trumps older liberal principles.
Okay, but here's a tricky question then. If the goal is self-definition and inner well-being, why do certain identities, specifically LGBTQ plus identities, seem to achieve this status of compulsory recognition, where society and law demand affirmation, while other potential self-defined identities, maybe things society finds taboo like, say, foot fetishism, or even something extreme like incestuous desire, remain completely unacceptable? Why isn't mere tolerance enough for the first group, but denial is mandatory for the second?
That is a really critical question, and it brings us back to Taylor and also thinkers like Hegel and the whole politics of recognition. Taylor emphasizes that the self isn't formed in isolation. It's a dialogical self.
Meaning it's formed in conversation with others.
Precisely. As Hegel put it, self-consciousness exists only in being acknowledged by other selves. We need recognition from others to even know who we are. Our identity is inherently social, relational.
Okay, so identity needs recognition, but that doesn't explain why some get it and others don't.
Right. The next piece is understanding that recognition doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens within a specific social and ethical framework. Taylor, drawing on Hegel again, uses the German concept Sittlichkeit.
Sittlichkeit. What does that mean, roughly?
Think of it as the established ethical life of a community. The shared customs, norms, institutions, the common sense moral understanding that structures social interaction, it's the framework within which recognition is sought and granted. The meaning of demanding recognition for being, say, a Roman soldier is totally different today than it was in ancient Rome because the Sittlichkeit has changed.
So the demand has to make sense within the current ethical framework.
Exactly. And the crucial shift in our modern Sittlichkeit is the move from honor to dignity, as Taylor describes it.
What's the difference?
Honor, historically, was hierarchical. You had honor based on your specific rank or role in society, a king, a knight, a samurai. It wasn't universal. Dignity, emerging strongly with thinkers like Rousseau, is fundamentally egalitarian. Every single human being possesses dignity simply by virtue of being human. It's inherent and equal.
And our society is built on dignity, not honor.
Overwhelmingly, yes. The language of human rights, equality, that's the language of dignity. So in an age of dignity, denying someone recognition is tantamount to denying their equal human worth. It's not just insulting. It's seen as an attack on their fundamental dignity.
And this connects to psychological harm again.
Absolutely. The argument made powerfully in cases like Brown v. Board of Education regarding racial segregation was that denying recognition, in that case through segregation, inflicts deep psychological damage. It creates feelings of inferiority, which violates the principle of equal dignity.
So that's why certain groups succeed in demanding compulsory recognition.
It seems to be the key. LGBTQ plus identities have been incredibly successful at framing their struggle in the language of dignity and psychological harm. They argue that non-recognition isn't just disagreement, but an attack on their inherent worth as human beings, causing tangible psychological injury. This resonates powerfully within our modern Sittlichkeit, which prioritizes both psychological well-being and egalitarian dignity.
While other identity claims, perhaps those linked to behaviors still strongly condemned by the prevailing Sittlichkeit, like incest.
They can't make that same claim effectively. They can't convincingly frame their demand within the accepted language of universal dignity and psychological harm in the same way. The current Sittlichkeit still finds those desires or identities fundamentally harmful or disordered, not just different expressions requiring affirmation for equal dignity.
Wow. Okay, so wrapping this up, we've journeyed from how elite ideas filter down via the social imaginary through the huge impact of technology enabling a poiesis or a creator mindset, landing on Reef's psychological man focused inward.
And seeing how that inward focus demands outward recognition, fueled by the shift from honor to universal dignity, all playing out within a specific ethical framework, the Sittlichkeit.
It shows how today's self is psychological, expressive, and demands public validation, often enforced through appeals to prevent psychological harm.
Yes, this psychologized, expressive individual is, historically speaking, a completely new phenomenon. And it's both a product of these massive shifts and a driver of our current social and political landscape.
And this brings us back to McIntyre and Reef's rather stark conclusion about all this.
Indeed. Reeve didn't see this therapeutic world as just a new type of culture. He provocatively called it an anti-culture.
Why anti-culture?
Because, for Reeve, a culture is fundamentally defined by its thou shalt nots, its taboos, its shared commitments that point individuals beyond themselves towards common purposes. The therapeutic model, by prioritizing individual psychological well-being above all else and dismantling traditional prohibitions, dissolves those very bonds.
And McIntyre's work on virtues and shared purpose really highlights what's lost there, doesn't it? Without a common understanding of the human good, a shared telos.
Moral discussion just collapses into what McIntyre called emotivism, basically, just asserting personal feelings and preferences with no common ground for argument. It creates an ethical vacuum.
Which leaves us with a really challenging final thought, drawing from Reef and McIntyre. If culture traditionally requires shared prohibitions and outward commitments to bind society, what actually holds us together when the primary, almost sacred commitment is directed inward, towards the fulfillment of the individual psychological self? What happens to the we when everything is about me?